Happy Wednesday, everybody. Hope you're having a good day today so far. Having a good week. Today's episode's going up kind of late today, I know. Um, Apologies for that. Just had some things to take care of this morning and was unable to get to it. And I would have recorded this last night, but I was so tired and I came home and I just fell asleep watching. I was watching Jacksepticeye play a new game, House of Ashes. House of Ashes. If you know anything about those games, I don't know who all listens to this that knows about video games. I don't know a lot, but he did. It's like I don't know if it's a series or if it's just a type of game that these programmers make, but they've made several of them, and they were really good, like Little Hope and Man of Medan. They were really good, and it's like watching a movie, and I really enjoy watching them, and I don't know why. It's nice to have him back on YouTube regularly now. I really missed him. He's really fun to watch. Anyway, today's episode's not going to be super long. It's going to focus on a story about, uh, I don't even know if I can say his name because then they may delete the video. Um, so we're going to refrain from using his name as best as I can. But, it's our oh holy expert for the Rona in the White House. And that doctor who is such a moron, that's who we're going to be talking about today. And funny about that, really quickly, is I was watching You Are Here last night, and I was watching it live, and there was a topic that they discussed that a priest was saying that because of um, what's going on right now, because of the Rona and the shutdowns and everything, that exorcisms were on the rise. Very strange. And this priest said that there was a malignant force behind it. And so I sent a super chat and I said, there is a malignant force behind it, and it's Dr. You Know Who. And it kept telling me I needed to edit my text and it wouldn't send. And I was like, am I trying to send too many characters? So I'm checking it. And I was like, oh, okay, hang on. So instead of spelling his name out, I removed the A and put an underscore, and then it's sent. So YouTube would not allow me to send a super chat with his name in it unless I censored it. Um, and I guess maybe the algorithm was picking up his name and the negative word malignant, and then talking about the Rona, so they wouldn't let me send it. All right, so we're going to talk about that today, and then we're going to look at some history of these types of things that happen. But first, we'll read our daily promise, which says, "The eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and his ears are open unto their cry." Psalm 34:15. God recognized us. Oftentimes, we do not see any sign of God answering our petitions, yet he hears our cries and deals with them specifically in his own way. Though we might not be constantly thinking of God, we are always in his thoughts as he hears our requests for help. Yeah, I think sometimes, you can pray for stuff and then um, maybe you don't hear and get an answer, or maybe you get an answer that's different than what you were expecting, so you don't realize that that's what it is. Um, Clearly, I think you have to be a lot more in tuned um, in a relationship with God to know that your prayers are being answered. But um, I've done that and wondered if I was ever going to get an answer to my prayers, and I probably have gotten answers that I never even realized I got. So who knows? But regardless, we should always pray. And boy, is there a lot to be praying about right now for sure. Okay, so the story I wanted to cover, if you haven't heard, so this is from republicworld.com, and it's about the experiment that he funded through the NIH that involved beagles being eaten alive by the sandflies. Some of y'all may have heard about this. I'm sure you have, because there were people on both left and right that were very upset about hearing about this. So, days after being accused of lying to Congress, White House medical advisor or we'll say he shall not be named, he who shall not be named, has now been blamed for funding projects that involve beagles being caged and fed to infectious insects. Earlier this week, White Coat Waste Project, an animal rights organization, said that he who must not be named used over $1 million of taxpayers' money to fund a Tunisian research lab which conducted cruel experiments on puppies. As many as 44 puppies were used as a part of the experiment, as per the animal rights organization. Some were also stripped of their vocal cords so that their barks were muzzled. Speaking to The Hill, a representative of the White Coat Waste Project said that he who must not be named led NIAID transferred U.S. dollars of $1.68 million grant to the lab to conduct the experiments in total. As per the group's investigation, young beagles were drugged and their heads were locked in a mesh cage filled with hungry sandflies so that the insects could eat them alive. They also locked beagles alone in cages in the desert overnight for 9 consecutive nights to use them as bait to attract infectious sandflies, the group added. A second experiment included the dogs in California being injected with drugs before being killed and dissected. Meanwhile, a third project saw puppies howl in pain while being experimented upon. In the aftermath, a team of bipartisan legislators have demanded answers from the NIAID chief. A letter that was signed by Democrat leader Cindy Axon and Republican Nancy Mace asked for a disclosure of the total funds that were spent on the experiments. In addendum, they have also demanded complete information on the number of experiments conducted on the puppies since 2018. So, an excerpt from the letter read, of particular concern is the fact that the invoice to NIAID included a line item for chordectomy. As you are likely aware, a chordectomy, also known as devocalization, involves slitting a dog's vocal cords in order to prevent them from barking, howling, or crying. This cruel procedure, which is opposed with rare exceptions by the American Veterinary Medical Association, the American Animal Hospital Association, and others, seems to have been performed so that experimenters would not have to listen to the pained cries of the beagle puppies. This is a reprehensible misuse of taxpayer funds. And then Lauren Bobart tweeted out that it's time to open the books on all of He Who Must Not Be Named's projects over the years. We need to understand exactly what sick things our tax dollars have been going to. And this is where I get confused because you see the sick experiments that have been happening on people over the last 2 years, psychologically brainwashing people, um, making them be fearful to just breathe, and nobody blinks an eye. I mean, of course, we have people that are against it, but people on the left, they totally accept it. It's normal. There's nothing wrong with mistreating people. But the minute they hear about animals being mistreated and there's an uproar, why are you more concerned about an animal than you are about how people are being treated? And the only thing I can figure is because people have a voice, they can speak up, they can fight back in a way that animals cannot. They cannot tell people what has happened to them. Um, Maybe that's why. Maybe they are less able to defend themselves as puppies for sure. Um, but still, that always made me curious. And maybe it's just because people just don't like people as much as they like their animals. It's a very likely possibility. Some people are obnoxious and annoying, and you would probably prefer a dog over those people. For sure, I would prefer a dog over most of the people on the left, definitely. So, in reading this, I wanted to see, it seems to me that in the name of science, the end justifies the means. And scientists are willing to do anything at any cost to forward their progression in the medical field and in science. And they clearly have no value of life whatsoever, not just human life, life in general. And they, I think this has always been, as science had been, people had started learning about science whenever people started doing that kind of stuff and doing scientific experiments. I'm sure it was a really, really long time ago. But when it started progressing into something more and we started learning more, they tend to think that they're these really great, untouchable people and they try to play God. And that to me is a very dangerous place to be. And I don't think that scientists should be allowed to do anything they want just purely in the name of science, no matter what kind of breakthrough it could bring to us, no matter how easy it can make life for us or how it can cure some disease that we don't have a cure for yet. There should be nothing that is inhumane towards people or animals, regardless of what the outcome would be. That's what I think. So, I wanted to take a look at some science experiments that have been done over the years from PETA.org, which, by the way, if you think PETA is some great organization that cares about animal rights, PETA is just as bad as anybody else. You could just go look into what they do, and you can see that it's not really about helping and saving animals. Probably it's just more about money. But they did have a list of some experiments that were done on animals, and they're actually occurring right now. And there's 5 of them, so I wanted to take a look at them. So we have the Elizabeth Murray's monkey fright experiments at NIH, which is the organization that funded this research on the beagles. So NIH experimenter Elizabeth Murray burns through taxpayers' dollars to traumatize intelligent social monkeys. In her twisted emotional responsiveness test, she saws open and injects toxins into monkey skulls to burn brain cells or suctions out parts of the brain. Then after placing the animals inside a cage with no room to hide or escape, she torments them with their worst fears, a fake but realistic looking rubber snake or spider, just to see how they'll react. When she's through with them, she kills them. Records obtained by PETA document that in 2019 alone, Murray used 132 monkeys in these experiments. While her cruel tests have caused extreme harm and trauma to all the animals she has used, the records specify that 72 of these monkeys were used in experiments that are known to cause pain. And I'm sure that we could probably get more information into that. But they do have a lot of places where you can go and, like, I guess, sign petitions to fight against these type of experiments. Then the next one we have is sepsis experiments on mice. Laboratories across the U.S. subject mice to barbaric sepsis tests reminiscent of the horror film The Human Centipede. To induce sepsis in mice, experimenters may stitch mice together along the length of their bodies and inject toxins into them, puncture the animal's intestines so that fecal matter and accompanying bacteria leak into their stomachs, insert a stent into the animal's colon so that fecal matter leaks out continuously into their bodies, or use other egregiously cruel methods. This is despite the fact that a landmark 2013 study revealed that the result of sepsis experiments done on mice don't apply to humans because sepsis is a different disease in mice. So it's doing them no good. They're not learning anything from it, but they're still doing it. If you've seen The Human Centipede, it's absolutely disgusting. I regret ever seeing that movie. But ew. I'm not going to go too much into them. I'm just going to read these little synopses of what they're doing because there's other ones that I want to talk about that are human experiments. So then we have the menopause test on marmosets at Umass. So, University of Massachusetts laboratory performs invasive surgeries on female marmosets in a ridiculous attempt to study menopause, which marmosets don't even experience in humans. Experimenters drill holes into the skulls of marmosets, thread electrode leads through their abdomens, and zip tie them into restraining devices. To stimulate menopause in these sensitive monkeys, experimenters surgically remove their ovaries and they use hand warmers on them to mimic hot flashes. UMass abruptly shut down good faith negotiations with PETA that were aimed at reducing the use of animals in experiments and modernizing its research program. And you have to ask yourself, if they're not, if the studies that you're doing cannot tell you anything about how something might be in a human body, why are you even wasting your time doing the studies in the first place? And to me, it would seem that these people are just evil and they kind of like to torture people or animals, kind of psychopathic. Brain mangling test on owls at Johns Hopkins. Experimenters at Johns Hopkins cut into the skulls of barn owls, insert electrodes into their brains, force them to look at screens for hours a day, and bombard them with noises and lights. The laboratory pretends that doing this will tell us something about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in humans. Well, I can tell you, ADHD in most children is a lack of discipline. Just discipline your hands properly, and they probably would have a better time. Sex experiments on sparrows at LSU. At Louisiana State University, experimenter Christine Lattin removes sparrows from their natural homes, pumps them full of sex hormones, releases them, and then torments them with terrifying calls from predators. These sounds can leave the highly social birds, who just want to raise and care for their young, in serious distress. At the end of the breeding season, Lattin recaptures and kills all the birds and their babies, and then removes their brains for analysis. What is the point? Like, clearly, what is the point? I don't understand it. But then I think that's bad on animals. And you come over here to allthatisinteresting.com and learn about the 4 most evil science experiments ever performed. Now, this is by Richard Stockton, and I guess it was fact checked by John Karowski to make sure everything was right, and it was updated August 25th of 2017. So, at their best, scientists represent the best in humanity: intelligence, curiosity, and skeptical rigor. This allows scientists to do things that ordinary people wouldn't be allowed to get away with. If a random person burst into your house with a bubbling test tube and shouted, "Quick, drink this," you'd call the police. But that person in a white lab coat, though, and you'll only delay long enough to thank them for coming in the nick of time. Scientists are human, however, and humans have been given that level of trust sometimes proved to be the last people in the world who should be trusted. From the Nazis to America's own horrific misdeeds, here are 4 of the most evil science experiments ever carried out. Well, where are they? Oh, yeah, I have it next. My bad. Okay, so this is from the Nazis. Almost any list of X most evil whatevers is pretty much obligated to have a bunch of Nazis on it, even if it's just a list of evil cupcake recipes. In non-consensual medical experiments of dubious scientific value, however, the Nazis really outdid themselves. Never has so much that was so bad been done for the enlightenment of so few for such little identifiable purpose. At Auschwitz, Dr. Joseph Mengele, or I don't know how you say his name, injected dye into the eyes of children to see if he could permanently change their color. He also famously tried to create conjoined twins by stitching his patients together. Thank your lucky stars it didn't work, because can you imagine if the Third Reich had perfected Siamese twin technology in time to win the war? Their elite Doppelsoldaten would have been unstoppable. Isn't it just a doppelganger? What is it? Doppelsoldaten. I know it's trying to say doppelganger, but let's see exactly what it's saying. I guess that's what they're calling it. It's just a name for the experiment, I guess. Okay. In 1942, Nazis in Baranowitz, I don't know, Poland, strapped a young boy into a chair and repeatedly hit his head with a mechanized hammer. It turns out that 1 out of 1 test subjects reacted negatively to this. Yeah. At the Ravensbrück women's camp, the effectiveness of sulfonamide, a synthetic antibiotic, was tested on prisoners. Their arms and legs were gashed and blood supply was cut off to stimulate battle wounds. Then the wounds were treated with bacteria and 5 will get you 10 rubbed with ground glass, because why not? The Nazi doctors who didn't escape to South America were put on trial after the war. Some, mostly administrators, were acquitted. The guilty were given sentences ranging from 10 years to death by hanging. So, happy ending? That's not actually true, because some of those Nazi doctors and scientists were brought here to the U.S. under Operation Paperclip, and they were in some of the highest levels of government at that time. What does that tell you about the U.S. government, even back in the 40s? So, how one covert Japanese unit killed hundreds of thousands of people. Unit 731 of the Japanese Army was tasked with developing advanced germ warfare techniques and making the world a worse place in general. Their greatest hits included the deliberate release of plague-infected fleas in Manchuria to kill as many people as possible. The targets were all civilians who played no part in anti-Japanese resistance. The Imperial Japanese Ministry of Gratuitous Evil could not be reached for comment. Unit 731 began in 1931 as a disease prevention unit. By 1935, however, the unit had been folded into the Kwangtung Army in Manchuria and was conducting experiments so horrific that it's difficult to imagine why their headquarters didn't just fold up like the house in Carrie and disappear behind an event horizon. The scale of the operation was huge. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in plague, anthrax, and cholera outbreaks started by the unit, including a single plague attack that the Chinese government estimates killed 580,000 people. An only somewhat smaller number of people were killed in the unit's other experiments. For at least 10 years, Unit 731 cultivated wild strains of disease in human patients to increase their virulence. Infected patients who succumbed quickly to particularly lethal strains were bled to death, and their blood was used to infect the next crop of prisoners. Prisoners were vivisected without anesthesia, limbs were frozen and thawed to study gangrene, left arms were cut off and grafted to the right side of the body, and sections of vital organs were removed piece by piece to study the progress of the unit's pet diseases. Unit 731 was one twirled mustache away from starting work on a Dr. Strangelove-style doomsday weapon when the Allies rolled in and pulled the plug. When the Soviets defeated the Kwangtung Army, they put the perpetrators on trial, sentencing them to between 2 and 25 years of penal servitude. The U.S. bitterly opposed these trials, refused to acknowledge their legitimacy, and offered immunity to practically every Unit 731 member who could be identified, including the unit commander, Shiro Ishii. At least one former member of the unit, Masami Kitaoka, found post-war work with Japan's National Institute of Health Sciences, where he spent 9 years infecting mental patients with typhus to see what happened. See all the grim details of Unit 731 in this recent documentary, which is on YouTube. Good luck, it's probably no longer available. The U.S. tests a chemical weapon on its own people, and the perpetrator walks free. In 1951, American dermatologist Albert Kligman reported to work at Pennsylvania's Holmesburg prison to study, of all things, ringworm. Realizing the potential of the inmate population and apparently forgetting literally everything he ever learned about medical ethics, Kligman eventually expanded his research into live drug trials, pathogen testing, and exposing inmates to dioxin, the active ingredient in Agent Orange, the chief chemical used in the United States herbicidal warfare program in Vietnam. Over the course of 23 years, Kligman obtained grants from the U.S. Army, Dow Chemical, and Johnson & Johnson, as well as academic support from the University of Pennsylvania to research the effects of some of the most dangerous chemicals in his arsenal on people confined under terms that rendered the idea of informed consent a grisly joke. By the time he finished, hundreds of patients had been knowingly infected with herpes, staph, athlete's foot, and dioxin. And if you can't see this picture, this is a Vietnamese child who suffered birth defects likely caused by dioxin Agent Orange. And that's really sad. Oh my gosh. That's horrible. How could you do that to a person? As with the other entries on this list, Kligman's results were of limited value. Those who reviewed his work found it to be so sloppy and riddled with conflicting data that it was excluded from consideration by the Food and Drug Administration. Well, thank God they did that. Essentially, Kligman spent over 2 decades torturing prison inmates, and his results weren't good enough for government work. Kligman managed to evade punishment and lived to just short of 94. To the end of his life, he swore he did nothing wrong. See, and you think that this kind of stuff just happens outside of the U.S. because we have regulations and laws that don't allow it. Maybe we have more regulations and laws than we did back then, but I would venture to say that this kind of stuff still happens on U.S. soil that we have no idea. Maybe Area 51s where they do some weird experiments that we don't know about. And maybe it has nothing to do with it, but have you ever taken a look at a map of all the people that go missing in our national forests? like an astronomical amount of people that just disappear and there's no trace of them. They never find a body. They never find nothing. They're just gone. What if some of those people were being picked up by the government to have experiments done on them, and it could easily be explained away as they got lost in the forest and they were eaten by a bear, and that's why you can't find their remains? Very easy to explain that away, and I would not put it past our government to do stuff like that. They're evil people. Anyway, evil science experiments, the result of injecting people with the ingredients of nuclear bombs. So, in the 50s and 60s, there was hardly a quicker way to get your research funded by the US government than to pitch the idea of exposing people, especially minorities, to ridiculous amounts of radiation to see what would happen. Some of the highlights. As part of the program to develop nuclear weapons, unsuspecting soldiers and patients at a Chicago hospital were injected with some of the weapon's chief ingredient, plutonium. Unsurprisingly, only about 1 in 4 lived long enough to hear about what had been done to them. Dr. Cornelius Rhodes, cancer researcher and future member of the Atomic Energy Commission, injected Puerto Ricans with active cancer cells to monitor the results. They, of course, died. And that's not the first time that the U.S. has experimented with Puerto Ricans. We did the same thing with birth control. And not to mention, and I talk about that in an episode. I talk about the experiment with the Tuskegees, infecting them intentionally with syphilis. This is why some people are very hesitant of getting jabbed with anything that the government promotes, and I don't blame them for it. So, according to a cheery note written by Rhodes, quote, the Puerto Ricans are the dirtiest, laziest, most degenerate and thievish race of men ever to inhabit this sphere. I've done my best to further the process of extermination by killing off 8 and transplanting cancer into several more, end quote. YouTube, those were not my words. It was Dr. Rhodes just repeating a quote. Please don't get me for hate speech. Dr. Eugene Sanger, under the guise of treatment, exposed dozens of African American patients to over 20,000 x-rays worth of radiation. It was enough to cause severe pain, bleeding, and at least 20 identifiable deaths. In the 90s, the families of some of Sanger's patients sued him, eventually winning a $3.6 million settlement. So, of course, there's a lot more, and like I said, this is a very short episode. One I wanted to just go across real quick. The Little Albert experiment. And I don't know how many people have heard about this. I heard Sydney talk about this on You Are Here, so I wanted to see what exactly it was. So, the Little Albert experiment was named predictably after a baby named Albert who was the center of this cruel yet fruitful experiment on inducing fear in children. John B. Watson, a researcher at Johns Hopkins University, together with his graduate student Rosalie Rayner, published their results in the Journal of Experimental Psychology in 1920. They wanted to know whether it was possible to condition a phobia into a child. Spoiler alert, it totally is. In the experiment, little Albert was placed in a room with a regular white lab rat, which he had no problem playing with. Next, the experimenters made a loud sound every time Albert reached for the rat, which, not surprisingly, caused him to cry out in fear. Over time, Albert would recoil in fear every time he saw the rat, even in the absence of the loud sound. They later found that Albert had generalized his fear to include other furry objects, including a dog, a sealskin coat, and a man dressed as Santa Claus. The results of this experiment solidified what psychologists had begun to understand about classical conditioning with Pavlov's initial experiments on dogs. The triggers for fear, together with other innate emotional responses, could be learned. The American Psychological Association reports that Albert was, in fact, a 9-month-old named Douglas whose mother was employed as a wet nurse at a campus hospital and received $1 for her child's participation in Watson's experiment. The fear conditioning the baby went through was never reversed. So he was afraid of Santa Claus forever. Then you have the HeLa cells, which, the oldest and most commonly used cell line in research, are ubiquitous in the pages of academic journals. Unlike most cell types, which die after a few days, these cells are immortal and multiply indefinitely. Their contributions to science are countless. They were crucial in developing the polio vaccine and are used today in research on AIDS, cancer, and drug testing. But as much as we sing the cells' praises, we rarely acknowledge their controversial roots. The original cells were taken from a patient named Henrietta Lacks without her knowledge or consent. Lax arrived at Johns Hopkins Hospital in February 1951 complaining of a pain in her abdomen, which eventually turned out to be a cervical cancer tumor. While she was receiving radioactive treatment for her cancer, which involved surgery to sew radium tubes into place, her surgeons removed healthy and cancerous sections of her cervix without telling her. These cells were eventually given to Dr. George Gay, who went on to study and cultivate the immortal cells. Lax died of her cancer 8 months later, and her family didn't learn that her cells had been removed until the 1970s when scientists from around the world began calling the family to learn more about their unique genetics. I'll scan through this one pretty quickly. The Holmesburg prison trials, it was 1969, and there was a miracle treatment for acne, a derivative of vitamin A, which was retin A, like retina, you get it? So it's still the world's leading acne treatment today, and the WHO's list of essential medicines, and it's used to treat acute promyelectic leukemia. What most people don't know is that it came at a pretty steep human cost. It was discovered by Dr. Albert M. Kligman, right? And this is the same thing, the prison in Philadelphia in 1951. He was like a farmer seeing a field for the first time. So, according to a history of the experiments written by Alan M. Hornblum, who visited Holmesburg 20 years after Kligman's testing began, the jail was packed with shirtless prisoners whose backs were striped with gauze, adhesive tape, and scars from biopsies. To be fair, there was no law against scientific testing on human prisoners in the 50s and 60s, but by withholding detailed information about the experiments from the prisoners, Kligman is considered to have broken the first law in the Nuremberg Code. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Not that it would have mattered much to the inmates, who were being offered anywhere from $10 to $300 a day, depending on the experiment. The Milgram Experiments. So, could it be that Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we call them accomplices? These are the questions Yale social psychologist, what is all this, asked when the Nazi war atrocities were made public. They went on to form the basis of his famously controversial experiments on obedience to authority figures, which were first published in the Journal of Abnormal Social Psychology in 1963. The experiment's volunteers were first paired with another person who was actually a confederate of Milgram's. The pairs were then asked to draw lots to determine their roles, either teacher or learner. But the experiment was rigged so that the volunteer was always the teacher. The learner would then be placed in a room and hooked up to several electrodes. The teacher would join an experimenter, an actor dressed in a lab coat, in a separate room and presented with an electric shock generator. The experimenter instructed the teacher to first teach the learner a series of word pairs, then test the student. Every time the learner made a mistake, the teacher was told to administer an electric shock, each more intense than the last. Of course, there weren't any real shocks involved, but the learner in the other room responded by screaming in pain every time. Milgram hoped these experiments would shed light on what had happened among Nazi officers during the war. Although participants showed clear signs of distress once they started to hear their learners cry out in pain, many of them didn't stop. In his first round of experiments, 65% of participants administered shocks up to the highest level. His data pointed to one terrifying conclusion: ordinary people will indeed be obedient to authority, even to the point of killing a fellow human being. And then the last one, oh no, not the last one. There's two more. Stanford Prison Experiment. And this is the U.S. Office of Naval Research funded the Stanford Prison Experiment, hoping it would identify the causes of conflict between prison guards and prisoners. In the studies, which took place at Stanford in 1971, participants were randomly assigned the role of prisoner or prison guard, and it almost seems like this may be similar to the other one, and had to commit to the role for the duration of the experiment. While the experiment was meant to last 2 weeks, lead researcher Philip Zimbardo had to cut it short after 6 days. Participants took their roles way too seriously, and things quickly got out of hand. Prison guards were told they couldn't physically harm the prisoners, but they could say things to control them psychologically. Within days, guards were referring to prisoners by number instead of name to induce depersonalization. They had arbitrary status systems among them, and they even began forcing prisoners to take off their clothes or sleep on the concrete. By the time the experiment ended, Zimbardo had, like Milgram, revealed a difficult to stomach truth about human nature. Ordinary people were incredibly impressionable when faced with an authority figure, especially one supported by a social or cultural institution. And then the last one is gene editing in embryos. So, unethical testing isn't just a thing of the past. Earlier this year, okay, when was this written? Does it? I don't know. I don't see a date on it, but it looks like October, maybe, of this year. Okay, earlier this year, Chinese scientists reported in the online journal Protein and Cell that they had successfully performed germline modification on human embryos. These days, the ethics of human embryo testing is becoming increasingly hazy. While it's still not considered acceptable among Western scientists, the field's potential to change the face of medicine consistently threatens to reopen the debate. If scientists manage to perfect gene editing in embryos, it'll completely revolutionize genetics as we know it. It would effectively allow us to correct devastating genetic diseases in babies before they're even born. The research team behind the discovery successfully used pre-implantation embryos, which can't result in a live birth, to modify gene responsible for the blood disorder uh, thalassemia using CRISPR-Cas9 technology. Western scientists have used this system successfully in animal models, but the Chinese study represents, as far as we know, the first time it's been used in humans. So, this is what I was trying to say, that scientists today, so it was written, this particular one looks like it was written July of 2015. Um, they're increasingly trying to play God. I mean, genetic editing of embryos. Um, when you do that, you're admitting that God made a mistake in the human that he's developing inside the womb, and he makes no mistakes. So if they're going to have a disease, if they're going to have a disability, Down syndrome, whatever it may be, that was done on purpose and for a reason. And God does not intend you to go in there and try to change things, because I guarantee you, the minute you start trying to change the way a norm to change the normal process of a birth, whether they have birth defects or not, you start messing around with that, and I really think a lot of bad things could happen to you. Most likely, you would lose your child, and you may never be able to have children again because you attempted to play God and fix what you believe is a mistake that He made, and it shouldn't be done. This is the kind of stuff that it's really disgusting that people can be this evil and this. I mean, it's psychopathic to treat humans and animals alike, but even more so humans. And we know of other experiments that people have done on people. Dr. John Money and what he did to those brothers. I mean, it's just I don't know what leads people to be this degenerate, to be so I can't even think of the word, to be just so callous to other human beings. I don't know if they're taught to be that way. I don't know if they're possessed by something in some way. I just don't understand how any normal human being can be led down that road to do these types of atrocities on people and animals. And as someone who is normal and does not relish in the thought of torturing animals or people, I don't know how you get to that point. I don't know if it's power. I don't know if it's greed. I don't know what leads you there, but it's very, very disgusting. And he who must not be named should definitely be removed from his position in the White House. I believe he should be in prison. He's done a lot of things up to this point, and this is just really like the nail on the coffin. It's time to move on. It's time to get him out, find somebody else. But the former vice president, so that he's not going to get rid of him. That there is nothing that he who must not be named could do that would get him fired or removed from the White House. So, as much as I like Ronald Reagan and think he was a great president, I think he made a huge mistake bringing he who must not be named into the White House back then under his administration. That was a mistake. And if Reagan were alive, I think he'd realize he made a mistake doing that. Anyway, that's the end of the episode today. I just thought it was interesting to look at what people are willing to do in the name of science, and it's horrendous and it's atrocious, and I don't, it shouldn't be allowed, not just in the US, but anywhere. And nobody seems to care if it's people. They only speak up as soon as they learn animals are involved, which is still disgusting. Anyway, you can go to my link tree, to my social media, go to Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, Pandora, Anchor, subscribe to the show. You can leave me a review. And then on YouTube, please like, share the video, and then subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell so you know every time I upload a new video. And I hope to see you back here on Friday. Y'all have a good rest of your day, and God bless.